This is Hunter Muse.
And this is Chris Snipes, and you are listening
to The Melt.
Yeah, what is happening in Spain? What's going on with the land-made man and all of that stuff?
Well, I suggest we start. I just suggest we start because if we go down that rabbit hole, we could be talking for an hour.
We are,
or have we started?
Let's start. Let's call it a start.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, goats, chickens, and a vineyard is the latest. The vineyard is the latest addition. So, yeah, the land is remaking me in its image, and I'm trying to live up to the biblical injunction to be fruitful and multiply. I can't have kids, but I can multiply grapes and goats and have dominion over the earth, which is very politically incorrect nowadays. But I do think there was once a positive meaning to that. And so it's a symbiotic relationship, I feel. The potentially I have with nature. I'm reforming it in certain ways because I have to, because that's my job, and it's reforming me internally. And those are the main points, actually. As far as life in Spain, it's not that different, except for the climate and certain opportunities like vineyards from life anywhere else, because I don't see anyone. I'm happy to say, just the goats, my wife, a couple of cats, the chickens drive me nuts, and when I have to go shopping, and I have a Chinese acupuncturist actually, so I see him.
Nice.
But I mean, we're not integrating into society, but we came here for the very opposite reason, right? To disintegrate from society. While society disintegrates, we would disintegrate also from it. So that's no surprise there. It's just us and the animals and the plants pretty much currently, in the occasional online endeavor, but I'm doing that less and less as well.
Sure. Do you guys have a chunk of land?
We have 7 acres, which is
cool.
too much, because most of it's undominated. It's wild. But we did have in mind the possibility of expansion as things fall apart, as the Talking Heads song goes. If there are people who are looking for, when there are people who are looking for places to go to, if we know any of them and they know us, we could actually have land for other people to use, to live on. That's kind of been on the back burner the whole time. But we only use currently, including the goats, we only use less than an acre, I think.
And so I think at one point I thought that you were setting out to sort of develop a meditation or retreat center, but you're more creating sort of a sanctuary for people to go to maybe when things get a little more rough.
Oh, well, they're mutually inclusive, absolutely, because a retreat, that would be a retreat that never ended. Whereas the retreats we have had in mind, although we haven't done anything towards any organizing this, could be to do with learning that, like having a brief period of actually living on the land and to some extent off the land, and like building your own gypsy cabin or your own tree house, whatever it would be, things of that nature that would give people the opportunity to have a taste of the agrarian life. I'm not even sure what the adjective is for it, the wildlife, another Talking Head song, and see if they like it. And that also could be consistent with a more long-term thing, as in you can come and see if you like it and start to build your tree house and even finish your tree house, and then either you stay or you go. And if you go, we get the tree house, and if you stay, well, you obviously have to keep on working and then you keep, or just become independent and pay rent or something. I don't know what. Anyway, we're a long way from that, but it's easy enough to imagine, and I don't think it would be that hard logistically. Just a question of takers. I mean, I recently sent out a newsletter announcing about the vineyard because it has a beautiful little shack, a stone shack, except it's not a shack because it's fully working with solar panel and fridge and everything. It's ready to live in, almost on the water, saying, anyone who knows me, you can come and live here in winter for free, because we got it just as an investment, and probably won't be able to rent it in winter anyway. So I've already have extended a number of invitations to all and sundry. So far nobody's taken me up on it, which I'm not at all disappointed or surprised by. I feel I've done my duty. I won't get prevented from going to the kingdom of heaven because I'm too much like a rich man. I'm busy, for the whole time I'm offering to share it.
Where in Spain is it?
It's northern Spain. It's Galicia.
Oh, wonderful.
So what is the greater context like? What is the government like there? I mean, I know there's sort of anarchic areas of Spain. Are you anywhere near those?
Anarchy, I don't know. I don't know if I'd want to be near anarchy unless it was an idealist's version. Well, Galicia, I mean, it's not as though I don't follow local politics or larger politics. My wife follows the larger thing, so she keeps tabs on. I have a list that she made actually of reasons to be in Galicia, Spain in general, in terms of all of the advantages here, and that does include, at least currently, a government that isn't so WEF, World Economic Forum, aligned or affiliated. Obviously, they're still, they have to play ball, but they're generally not as on program as other major European governments. It doesn't mean that wouldn't change. But yeah, I don't follow the minutiae of it. And as I said earlier, I don't really have much experience of being in Spain particularly. I don't have much dealings, even though I've been buying property and whatnot. I've got residency, so obviously I have the minimal amount of dealing. But yeah, I mean, the Spanish are notoriously bureaucratic, as in the paperwork and things like that can be a real headache. And the other aspect that Spain that's observable is that they, as you probably know, they had many decades under a dictator, Franco.
Yeah.
And so they've only had a few decades of non-dictatorship. And so they've been catching up with the rest of Europe, and I don't mean that in a good way. So there are certain attitudes here, but one of them includes an awareness of what a draconian government is like, and so perhaps a healthy degree of skepticism and suspicion about government and government control, although you wouldn't have guessed it in the last 3 years. People were quite compliant here, but that may also be an example of they just know that you've got to keep your head down without necessarily believing. You just have to act like you believe. I don't know. I didn't do enough surveys to actually gauge. Anyway, this is just some general points.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that had something to do with the decision to move there, because maybe you were, you would be in a greater political context where you would just kind of be left alone to do whatever the hell you wanted to do.
It wasn't factored into the decisions. We didn't look into the deep background of Spain.
Gotcha.
Obviously, living as far away from populated areas was always part of the package. We're actually not as far away as I thought we might end up. And we even have a couple of neighbours here, or actually quite a few, but I mean a couple that are close. And in the end, I did have to say, well, first of all, this is what's happened, so it's probably a good reason for it. But then also I began to see that one observable good reason is that if you're in a community, a small community, when things do start falling apart, you do have some of the connections you need. Like we know somebody who raises rabbits. We don't know them personally. We know that there's a mill here for wheat, for making flour. Obviously neighbors who grow their own produce, they give it away. We give ours away. We're already part of a network that potentially could be more self-sustainable by working together, which is the only way any of us are going to do it. I know
Absolutely.
there's not going to be Jeremiah Johnson. I mean, somebody could do that. But.
I haven't seen that movie in a long time.
I know. It's a good reference.
Yeah, exactly. I remember seeing it at the theater. And then there was a meme, a Jeremiah Johnson meme or something like that, where I don't remember what the text of the meme was, but it had Robert Redford was just sort of giving this 1,000-yard stare to the camera. And of course, some word underneath that made it all seem funny. But
I really want to talk about the book. I'm so curious. You have such a brilliant mind. I'm interested in how you chose this subject.
The Kubrickon book?
Yes.
Yeah, I get that question. Actually, that particular question, I do get it. I mean, I've only done half a dozen interviews for this book, I think, but I think almost all of them, or perhaps all of them, have asked that. I'm going to turn the tables on you. What can you be more specific? Like, do you mean why did I choose to write about Kubrick? Or because to me, as I hinted at the beginning, Kubrick doesn't really interest me much, but the Kubrickon isn't really about Kubrick because you haven't read it. But Chris can tell you it's not really about Kubrick. It's about something that's observable. I think I've tried to demonstrate it. By looking more closely at Kubrick and his films, and most specifically the people who are enthralled to them. So all my recent books is very much about culture and the insidious, or the manipulative, or the infiltratory aspects of culture, how it gets under our skin.
Yeah, I see that as more Kubrick as being more the nexus of all of this other stuff that's going on around him, and his movies, as you stated in the book, sort of being used to almost gauge how people interact with them. And in many ways, it seems like the viewers have taken the bait and really have just deep dived into them so much that they parse every syllable and every camera shake in them to try and mine some deeper meaning.
Yeah, and so I mean, last time we spoke, we talked about 16 maps and Hollywood. So I think we probably all pretty much have an idea of, at least my view, but I think it's probably your view as well, you plural, of Hollywood movies in general, the manipulative aspects of them.
Yeah.
So this is going deeper into a specific example that the thin end, it's looking at the thick end of a wedge, the thin end of which is that movies, but also probably everything in culture, are designed one way or another to elicit a response from us and to affect our perceptions, to influence our perceptions, and therefore influence our behavior. Because if you influence people's perception, you influence how they think about themselves and the world, and then you influence how they behave. So that's the thin end of the wedge. Basically, anything that affects us, whether it's Jeremiah Johnson or whether it's Crime and Punishment, or something very lowbrow like Big Brother or something, reality TV. It doesn't matter really. It's we engage with it because it changes our mood and it changes the way we experience things. That's the whole point. So what I look at with Kubrick is to what degree could that be taken in terms of movies that are designed primarily as a way to map and measure and control and direct that interaction point between the viewer, the experiencer's perception, and the artifact itself, like a kind of symbiosis.
Right. But he has a specific audience.
Yeah.
You know, you could look at like Marvel films as being more of a wide swath of an audience and perhaps more of a propaganda machine than Kubrick films. So it seems like what I like about the idea is that there's more of a infiltrating of society in the Marvel sphere, but there's more of a specific messaging in the Kubrick world.
I don't know if it's about specific messaging exactly, but it's I mean, yeah, the Marvel things, they're populist and they're a very crude kind of propaganda, we could say. I mean, you can just see the way Iron Man is just so obvious and easy to see how that could have been designed from day one. I was actually hearing Stan Lee talk about when he created Iron Man. He was like, how can we make this guy sympathetic because he's selling arms to the military and this, that, and the other. This was in the 60s, if it's true. And so, I know, I'll give him a heart condition. So that was interesting, if that's true. Like, even back when he was invented, there might have been some sense, actually, this is a propaganda vehicle because he's a superhero who works for the military. But anyway, certainly that became explicit with the movie franchise, that there wasn't a coincidence why Iron Man became the linchpin of the Marvel universe, even though he was more minor in the comic world, in the comic books, because he's the most easily adapted to military propaganda. And that's really what's behind the Marvel stuff. So it's pretty simple. Now, if you look at Kubrick, he's apparently very anti-war, anti-military. He seemed to have this sensibility that is to this day is appreciated and heralded as being subversive, intelligent, compassionate, questioning, etc., etc. Like he's almost at the opposite end of the spectrum. The populism of Marvel with the elitism of Kubrick. Kubrick movies are elitist. So that's a higher level of influence, and it's a higher level of propaganda. Like, it really can't look like propaganda at all to work as propaganda. And in fact, I'd say in a way, it isn't propaganda as we normally think of it, because, I mean, there are elements of that. Absolutely, there are, actually, because I've deconstructed 2001, for example. That's transhumanist propaganda, as I see it. Certainly space colonization propaganda. That's pretty obvious. So it's not either or, actually. But when somebody works at the level Kubrick did, or Kubrick and company, even when it does have propagandist aspects, which to me are very obvious with 2001, they get overlooked because it's a work of art, in quotes. So that's the first thing, is that if he's working at a very high level, elitist, or other filmmakers consider 2001 now the best film of all time, which is a flashpoint, really, that the way that he's regarded, he's influencing the influencers. That's the first point. So, and how the propaganda gets very well hidden when you're working at that high level. The second point I was going to get to was that if you're, this is much subtler and harder to describe, but if the object of the propaganda isn't primarily to implant ideas into your audience, but actually to extract, I'm going to keep it simple, then that's a different level. Like I'd say, the Kubrick movies aren't so much about indoctrination, although they have that aspect. They're more about extraction. They're designed to extract information from, it's kind of a thesis statement, but obviously it's going to need some unpacking, from the collective consciousness. And part of that, or central to that, is this elitist thing where the movies will get raised up and framed as extremely important social artifacts that require study, like the Bible, which is my current interest. Obviously, the Bible's influence is incomparable. There's nothing else in human history, in the West anyway, that can compare or compete with the influence of the Bible. Anyway, it's just a counterpoint. But in cinema, we're practically at the point, we could say now historically, whether it's true or not, there's this idea that Kubrick is the most influential and the most important movie maker. And I say, even if that's not true, it becomes true. Obviously, if people believe that, they give that much importance to it, and then it becomes true. And that's how you create a consensus. And the consensus, of course, is a way to manipulate perceptions and beliefs, as we've seen in the last few years with the COVID and all that. Anyway, I actually said a lot of different things there, but hopefully they can be strung together in some way. Makes sense.
How do you think that Kubrick became sort of such a fetish object for movie buffs? How did he become the poster boy for that? Do you think that was orchestrated?
I have a theory about that. Actually, that's, I'm finding myself, I am talking about Kubrick, so I just, whatever.
Just give in.
I'm delivering where I said I wouldn't. But yeah, I have a theory about that, which is that Kubrick, he appeals to a particular kind of male intellectual, and it's not that they're male, but that this is more typical, more easily found, more commonly found in men, who wants to be a genius, who wants to be thought of as a genius and seen as a genius and hailed as a genius without revealing anything about himself, without being vulnerable in any way, which is actually, it's theoretically or in principle, that's impossible. I mean, I think the whole idea of genius is a bad idea personally. Yeah. But if we go back enough in time, we say somebody like, how far back do we have to go? Shakespeare. Let's leave it, an easy example. I don't actually believe it was one guy. I tend to believe there was more than one. But if that was one guy, you kind of have to say, well, you got to invent a word like genius for somebody who can do all that stuff.
Yeah.
What was my point? That it's impossible. Like Shakespeare, the works of Shakespeare would not have the value they have if they didn't reveal an awful lot about the person or the people who wrote them, because they're getting into the real heart and the soul of the human condition. Yes. Or the Book of Job, as I say, which is what I'm currently exploring in a deep way. The Book of Job reveals a lot about the human condition. So the person who wrote it, they had to drag in there and get it out. Kubrick movies don't reveal anything about Kubrick. Not really. They reveal his interests, but they don't reveal about his interior life.
Yeah.
And the way that's been simply summed up by critics of Kubrick, as in those who don't just fall down and worship him and say he's created a whole new language, is they're cold. His movies are cold. They're emotionally kind of empty.
Wes Anderson, in that vein, seems to be sort of Kubrick light, because I get the same, or I don't get the same shit from his movies. They're not personal. They're very cold. There's no human interaction. I mean, there is, but anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to get you off your point.
Sure, he came up in the comments actually in the last interview I did, so it's not a total non sequitur. But yeah, okay. So without digressing into other examples, just to finish this point, that's my theory. It's not actually in the book. It's not particularly central to the thesis, but that makes it a good question actually, because I don't have to repeat anything. It is relevant, of course. Like, why do so many guys get obsessed about Kubrick? That's my theory. Like, anyone who worships, you could say anything really, but who picks a figure in culture to worship them or create a kind of, they don't create a cult, but they might participate in a cult even without knowing it. They're part of how a cult gets created around a figure. They want to be close to greatness. That's just baked into it. You have to envy. If you admire somebody and you're human, you have to envy them as well. You really, most guys want to be the thing that they admire, and that's why they admire it. And so what is it that's admirable about Kubrick? Well, that's the question that you asked in a way. And one of the things is, he's super bright, he was super intelligent. The other, obviously, aesthetically, he had a great eye. But one thing that's clear, it wasn't because he was such an emotionally feeling kind of guy, or that he put so much personal stuff, or that he was working out his personal demons like other filmmakers we could name. Even Hitchcock, who I juxtaposed Kubrick with in certain ways to show the differences. Even Hitchcock, who was an entertainer, unlike Kubrick, who was an elitist, trying to be much more than an entertainer. Hitchcock put an awful lot into his movies. You can really get a sense of his obsessions. Kubrick, what's his obsession? Like technology, human intelligence. It's very kind of weird and abstract, and so that's central to my thesis. I think Kubrick his interest was in what constitutes intelligence, and can technology simulate intelligence. That's my thesis, essentially. And of course, artificial intelligence, one thing we can be sure of is it's going to be very cold. It's not going to have human feelings.
Yeah.
So, and that's true of Kubrick's movies. They don't have much human feeling.
They
And
could
so
be
that I
both.
can feel.
They
Sorry.
could both be considered Freudian filmmakers.
Hitchcock and Kubrick.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, I don't know. Do you want to say more? Or?
Well, I think that they both are examining issues with women and exploring issues, maternal issues. I feel like the women in both of their films are very interesting characters. You know, I think Hitchcock, for all intents and purposes, perhaps had a much more misogynistic approach when it came to women, where I would posit that Kubrick, it seemed to have more of a curiosity about women and maybe the layers of female relationships with men and kind of the power that women have in the male female dynamic.
Right. Well, certainly Kubrick, certainly Eyes Wide Shut is the obvious example. He's been analysed in this way as the commentary and the subtext of his films and so on. But that doesn't actually interest me very much, because I don't think that's what most people who study Kubrick movies in this intense way, I don't think they're particularly interested in that stuff. There are a few academics, and they're necessary to maintain this idea that Kubrick was a great filmmaker who was working out all these profound questions. But my sense is that Kubrick actually wasn't that interested in those subjects. That's my feeling. Whereas Hitchcock, I felt, it was kind of life and death. I'm like, he couldn't even sexually perform. He was so obsessed with the unobtainable woman and his mother, Psycho, and so on. Like that's the what interests me there is that difference. Or right now, anyway, what I was exploring is that difference. Sure, I mean, if you look at any man, probably a Western man who's making movies, let's say, or is successful in the world, you probably will find similar Freudian issues. I wouldn't argue against that, but I don't know how much that reveals, because they're probably fairly universal, those kind of issues. At
I
least,
just
yeah.
I just think of that moment. This was in the Room 237 film that we just watched as kind of a primer for this interview. I was watching part of it, and one of the scenes that kept getting brought up was the actual Room 237 and what that represented in the film. And when Jack Nicholson goes into that room and he sees the woman in the bathtub, and what that whole scene, kind of pulling the layers back of that scene of what that represented. So I think that was the thing that kind of brought this Freudian element of the unattainable woman, or the woman being corroded or somehow luring him in, and then being on some level representing like this demonic force or this death energy
In the woman. Well, I mean that I do somewhat get into, not that scene, but in The Shining, I do get into a slightly Freudian interpretation of The Shining, and that's probably because it's the only Kubrick film to me that does reveal something about him. Like you could say in Eyes Wide Shut, obviously there were lots of ideas and themes and stuff around man, woman, this, that, and the other, but you can't separate the medium from the message. Like Eyes Wide Shut, to me, that there's nothing recognizably human in that movie. Really, the characters is just so strangely stilted. So then that's, to me, that's proof he's doing something else, and he's managed to keep himself out of it, really. Whereas The Shining, I think he couldn't keep himself out of that movie. That's just the only Kubrick movie of later years that I actually like and find that has some richness. And so I do interpret that movie in the Kubrickon. It's almost like, I don't know what Chris thinks, but it's almost like a departure from the main thesis, because I examine the Shining, for its psychological content, and what I see it as a kind of blueprint. And I even tie together all the Room 237 interpretations and show how they're all related to betrayal by the father, or a father who doesn't give a son the blessing. So, and it's in different ways. Like there are 5 different interpretations in Room 237, and they all seem incompatible, but they all symbolically relate to this, to a son who is betrayed, abandoned by the father in some way. And the consequence of that is that the mother, the son is imprisoned by the mother, is trapped inside the mother's psyche. So I see the Overlook as the mother's psyche, is representing the mother's psyche. And of course, the whole movie is about a father who betrays his son, or tries to kill his son, more than a betrayal. And so, anyway, that is entirely consistent with the Kubrickon thesis, this whole idea of the matrix, which has to do with the male psyche that is trapped inside the female psyche, because it never managed to separate in childhood. And that's it's Big Mother. That's my next book. That's kind of the unified theory, I think, of all of my work, mapping hell. What went wrong? To me, that's what went wrong. The male of the species somehow never made it fully out of the mother's influence. But I mean, that's a very big subject. I'm just kind of throwing it in there because you kind of led us there, I think. And it's, as I say, it is in the book, The Kubrickon, and it certainly is consistent. I mean, it only gets fully developed in Big Mother, but it's consistent with the drive to create artificial intelligence. If you connect artificial intelligence to this larger thing that we're living in now, of creating a matrix, as in a whole social structure. Talk about the nanny state, the technocratic nanny state, an entire panopticon of artificial intelligence controlled and directed technocratic society. That is Big Mother. That's the recreation of the mother's body as an artificial construct in which no one ever gets to grow up.
Fascinating.
And for some reason, I'm randomly thinking of I don't know if you ever saw Ready Player One, or about the part of Ready Player One where they go into the movie. They actually go into The Shining. And I should have rewatched that before this interview. But yeah, there's a part of the movie. I don't know if you read the book or you saw the movie, but they actually go into the bathroom scene and interact with that. And it's crazy. I don't remember all the details about it, but that's sort of shows some AI leanings into that, because it was included in this totally fabricated universe that Ready Player One takes place in.
Yeah,
but it also shows it's what?
I didn't know that. That's a good point. I would have included that in the book had I known it.
Yeah. It's worth checking out, just at least that scene. But were there any of those narratives or any of those takes on The Shining from Room 237 that you leaned into a little more, that resonated with you more than the others? Or did any of them?
Well, they all resonated the way that they were presented. I very much enjoyed that, and that movie did help me to revisit The Shining, or give me a new interest in revisiting it. there's definitely something, and that was a big clue. Like Kubrick was creating movies, trying to create movies that would be Rorschach tests, that would reflect the viewer's psyche back at him, and which you could say that sounds perfectly benign and that's creative and all the rest of it. But I add these other elements and say that no, it was done more intentionally and more in a more manipulative way than simply giving the viewer an experience, but it's kind of harvesting. Because if you think what the viewer puts into a movie, let's say this interpretation, where does that go? Well, it went literally into room 237. So that's a kind of good literalization of this, that the viewer himself or herself is creating these stories via their interpretation that Kubrick didn't put in there, but he created the movie in such a way it would draw them out of the viewer. That's what I took about as attention harvesting, getting information from the viewer that will feed AI. Anyway, that was a digression because I was answering your question specifically. I mean, I suppose the most, I don't know, fruitful answer would be that it is all of them together. Like I might have a personal preference, I think, for John Fell Ryan's, because he didn't really do much interpreting. He just did this weird thing of playing them backwards and forwards at the same time and came up with all this stuff. And he wasn't particularly analyzing. So I kind of enjoyed the flavor of that most. Obviously, the moon landing is the most titillating. And probably that's the one with the most legs. I mean, that's a real meme, if you like, not a meme as in an image, but it went viral. I don't exactly find it credible. I find it credible that it was intended. Like of all the interpretations in room 237, I could see that one was intentionally put into The Shining, that people would interpret it, not because it's true, because I don't think it is true, or not wholly true anyway, maybe 50% or something, but because it would be generating obsession. Yeah.
So what 50% do you think is true? I'm just curious. I'm very fascinated by that whole narrative myself.
I think that the moon landing footage is fake, is true. As I've said on Twitter, it couldn't possibly have been Kubrick because it's too obviously fake. Surely he would have done a much better job, and he would have been appalled.
Good point.
To have ever been blamed for that footage, or to have been given the credit. But that's me. I don't want to insult anyone who does believe it's real, because that might sound like what I'm doing. But I certainly can't look at it without thinking, how did anyone ever believe that now? Whereas if I look at 2001, I think, well, it's better than the effects today.
True. Yeah. Maybe he was just doing it half-hearted. Maybe his heart wasn't into the moon landing. So
or it was meant to be, you could say, a cognitive dissonance creator, which is what I'd say about the Kubrickon, actually. So it'd be consistent in a different way. But you were meant to know at some level it was fake. But because, as we've seen in the last few years, Fauci and all that, you can have all the evidence of the senses that shows you something's fake. If there's a voice with enough authority telling you it's real, people will go with the voice saying it's real. And that creates a split, or it deepens the split that's already there. So it could be consistent with that. I should make it look fake, Stanley. And he's like, no, I'm sorry, Stanley, you've just got to do it really badly. Well, then why hire me would be the question.
But, he had other, as you stated in the book, he had other ties to those sorts of circles too. And then later on, or maybe even at that time, AI itself, which... What do you know about the Steven Spielberg, Stanley Kubrick AI situation? I don't know much about that movie, but I know Steven Spielberg kind of obviously was the one who actually made a movie out of it.
Get over, yeah. I don't actually know, and I don't get into it in the book, even though it's an obvious. It's not a smoking gun, but it's an obvious supports my thesis and totally confirms that Kubrick was very interested in AI, if that ever needed confirming. Why he did it, Kubrick and Spielberg working together. To me, that's a relevant data point too that gets overlooked. in terms of if Kubrick was really, I mean, I suppose Spielberg did do Schindler's List. It's not like Spielberg's a total, I can't think of a word for it, but you know, he's not totally disreputable. He has a reputation, but still, to me, they seem odd bedfellows. Is all the only point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, I mean, it was Stanley Kubrick must have known if he let Steven Spielberg take over his AI thing, it would be a stinker. Not that he wouldn't have made a stinker. Look at Eyes Wide Shut, but at least it was a Kubrick kind of stinker, which, as they write about, they're very intentionally bad in these very strange ways. He's trying to create anomalous experiences, whereas Spielberg just does stuff badly often, which is what happened with AI. Anyway, yeah, I didn't do a lot looking into the AI and the backstory as it happened.
Did you?
I just wanted to circle back to The Shining and the Overlook being perhaps a representative of the mother or the woman. Perhaps we could take it out one more level and say, instead of the Overlook, it's the earth that represents the mother or the woman. And the dichotomy is that Kubrick is choosing artificial intelligence or his desire for that kind of futuristic perspective over the earth. And he sees the earth as being the eviscerator or the controller. And so maybe breaking away from that is his desire to break away from that maternal thing. The earth is this obsession with artificial intelligence and the future.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I just don't go that deep into Kubrick's own psychology. Clearly, the Overlook doesn't represent woman or woman's psyche or woman's body in any healthy way. It's a demonic matrix, but that's very much the point. Like a male child who is trapped in the mother's psyche, it's because the mother herself is trapped. She's not functioning, and she's clinging to the child for some kind of salvation or some kind of emotional support. But sure, that would extend, that kind of pathological or dysfunctional or unhealthy attachment to the mother would extend to a rejection of the body and of the earth, and it goes very deep. That's the subject of Prisoner of Infinity, actually, and it brings us back to the moon as well, because the moon is an image of the mother as well, symbolically, although a dead one. I don't think the moon is dead, so again, it's not a very positive image. But the bid to get to the moon or conquer space, starting with the moon, is also a bid to get away from the earth. And so there's a weird symmetry in that, because at one level it's like the male psyche is trying to bond with the mother by getting to the moon, but it's just an image, because actually what he's doing is he's trying to get away from physicality. He's trying to get away from his body by entering into this dream realm, which brings us back to the Matrix again, and movies in general. Right? What are movies, and why does somebody make movies, and why do we want to watch movies? I think that Kubrick, to some degree, why I was interested, I think, in writing about this subject is that by aspiring to be the ultimate filmmaker, he maybe got closer to showing the pathology behind movie watching, movie making, and the technology as well. Because movies, they are a technology, unlike writing or song or much of the older arts. They weren't dependent on technology. I mean, you could say a flute is technology if you want it. So it began. You could even say a pen is technology, but you don't, strictly speaking, need a pen to write a poem. You certainly don't need anything to sing a song. Movies, on the other hand, were probably the first art form that was just completely and utterly dependent on technology.
Yeah.
So I would think.
You need lots of props and technology to make a movie, for sure.
Yeah, and the faking as well. Much more than any other art form previously, it's to do with faking reality.
What role, and perhaps you may have answered this question in so many ways before, but what role do you think that Kubrick, or maybe the better question would be Kubrick's movies, played in the superculture?
Well, can you? Because like I'm not sure what you mean by the superculture. I mean, I know you got it from me, but I'm not sure if I remember what I mean. So, yeah, how do you mean?
The superculture, meaning the larger context that what we know or what the average person knows as culture, that nestles inside of a larger culture that actually engineers and orchestrates what we call culture from sort of behind the scenes, in the sense of,
Yeah.
you understand what I'm
So
getting at?
you mean? So, you mean like politically, or in terms of actual organized crime and intelligence operations? Do you mean it in that sense? Then,
Yeah, things like
specific
that.
sense?
What is behind Hollywood, and a layer beyond what we're used to looking at, or what the average person is used to looking into.
I think. I mean, I haven't really answered this particular question before. People often ask about, what was Kubrick involved in? What were his ties and connections? And I get very bored very quickly trying to answer those questions, because it's always facts and figures and numbers and dates, but names. But this, what you're asking, is a little more general, and it's occurring to me that although they're not mutually exclusive, it seems as though Kubrick and his movies were, again, what I said earlier, I'm getting hoarse for some reason, a higher level of social engineering than average. Because it seems as though he was embedded. I mean, he was in bed with NASA, for example, for 2001, and that's. I mean, we can't really comment. We don't know in terms of the hierarchical structures who's high, CIA or NASA or the mafia. Who knows, right? They're all entangled. But certainly, NASA's closer to the legitimate institution that we think of as benign. We think of it as a hub of science and discovery and so on. In fact, I think NASA is really embedded in organized crime and child trafficking and these things, but don't quote me, because I got very little evidence for that. Some of it's firsthand, though, so I tend to believe it more because it's direct experience of just being too close to those kinds of institutions and locations where weird bad stuff is happening. But anyway, that's very much a digression. But so to me, it is all one superculture, and any powerful institution such as NASA is going to be involved in organized crime, probably the worst kinds of organized crime. But just talking, imagining that they are a bit separate, or we tend to perceive them as separate. It seemed that Kubrick was working very much with, if not for, that aspect of superculture that is the superculture which is less obviously shady and more, I guess, therefore, because it's more respectable. Like CIA, well, they've become kind of respectable again in the last few years, because we really have been I don't know what the word is, but things have got weird recently. But I was going to say the CIA intelligence organizations, they didn't really have a very good reputation over the last few decades. And so the idea that organized crime and stuff is involved in that, it shouldn't be that much of a stretch. But the world that Kubrick was moving in, although post Jeffrey Epstein, it shouldn't be a stretch either. It's very much sort of MIT science, NASA. That's what it seems like to me. That's my impression. And so I think he was, of all the filmmakers I can think of, bar none, he seems to be the closest to rubbing elbows with a kind of visible elite. Like Minsky, for example, Marvin Minsky, he was hanging out with this guy for 2001. Arthur C. Clarke, well, okay, he's a novelist, but still, he's kind of, you can see his elite connections. They're quite visible. And even the way that Kubrick is viewed, he is the film director's film director. Like,
Yes.
he kind of embodies the whole idea of elitism. even though he's often presented as this family guy and this very ordinary guy. Yeah, he lived in a mansion, but what would you do if you had money? You know, there's all those apologies for him. But he still exuded a kind of elitism. So yeah, I mean that's my sense is that he's more obvious. I think he's more obviously useful to the superculture, and because his influence and his operations were more closely aligned with the visible edifices of power like NASA and science and whatnot, as opposed to a filmmaker who's just embedding certain messages in there and creating some sort of insidious propaganda. I think my impression is that Kubrick was very much a key player in a long-term game plan involving the creation of this big mother thing, so artificial intelligence, algorithm run society. That without doubt is a major tool, if not the major tool, for social control in the 21st century. Computer technology, cybernetics, and Kubrick's the only filmmaker I know who is visibly involved in that aspect.
It's interesting. Hunter and I were recently how this is kind of a recent example of how Kubrick is still in the pop cultural lexicon. Hunter and I were recently watching this cartoon on Netflix called Inside Job, which is basically very conspiracy, like every conspiracy that you can possibly think of is somehow drawn, like looped into the plot arcs of this cartoon, which is episodic. And in one scene, they are in a cloning lab, and there are lots of different celebrities and religious icons. I don't remember who all was in there, but there's several of the cloning pods that had Stanley Kubrick in there. There's like 7 Stanley Kubricks. So it's like he's still around. He's still in the peripherals. Kind of interesting.
Yeah. Well, he's iconic, and it's ironic then that in a certain way he is identifiably this kind of elitist social engineering kind of filmmaker, while at the same time part of his central to his reputation in 2023, which has been really boosted by the post Room 237 crowd, as in the YouTube kind of exegesis, is that he was some sort of whistleblower, some sort of, yes, he was an insider, but no, he wasn't really working for them. He was working against them. His movies will set you free kind of idea. Yeah. That just seems really ironic to me.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting that he, as you said, was an insider, but he was sort of, if we're to believe all of these different ideas and theories, sort of sending us messages, very blanketed messages through his works. That one of them being that he participated in filming the moon landing, and that he obviously was not pleased by that, because he's, if we are to believe these different narratives, has been trying to tell all of us that he did have something to do with that, and maybe he was doing it against his will, and maybe there was some kind of deal made, and maybe that's how he got to the position that he was in. Who knows? Because he's, his movies, I'm more fascinated by the fascination that people have with Kubrick's movies than I am his movies. I don't think that they're that great, to be honest. So it's interesting that he's heralded as such a masterpiece filmmaker, and I just don't think his movies are that good. I mean, they're decent, they're well made, but they're not. It's subjective, I know, but
maybe. I mean, at some point, subjective has to become objective. It's just you don't want to be the guy who's saying, "I know that point," right? Because then you're probably going to get into trouble. But yeah, obviously, I agree, and hopefully, hearing the Kubrickon, it doesn't sound like you needed help, because you didn't probably have as a film writer for 20 years. For me, it was more than just, well, his movies aren't that great. I don't know what everyone sees. It was like, what's going on with you people? Why can't
Yeah.
you see? Particularly Eyes Wide Shut. It did bother me. It really did bother me. And so, I mean, this is kind of central to why, before we started officially doing the conversation, why I was saying, please don't ask me about Kubrick. It's just an ironic position to be in, because I don't think his movies are that interesting either, and certainly not that good, but something is, and somehow people got obsessed with them and he became raised up, and there is something to look at there. Obviously that's what we're talking about, or why we're talking. But it's still I do still feel a bit like Jack Torrance in The Overlook, like I've always been the caretaker. Why am I still talking about Kubrick? Can we get to something that's more interesting, right, in itself, as opposed to what Chris just said? Like, it's interesting that people are so interested in this, and there is a reason that's worth exploring, but still, at the end of the day, the result surely has to be, let's not talk about Stanley.
Yes. Should we move on to the Bible?
Well, I would love to, but I think it might disorientate your
That's okay.
listeners too much.
I'm totally open to that, but is there any other thing that you want to address, or anything that you see on this question list?
I'm just curious about the influence that being in his films had on people, because it seems like some of the people in his films went mad, not necessarily right after they were in his films, but I just wonder what the tone was like on these sets, and uh, how this idea of creating a film is creating this alternate universe or this alternate timeline. I find it fascinating to be an actor and be embedded in these realities, and how that would influence your life, you know, in subsequent films that you've made or subsequent sets you were on. And I guess that was the part of Room 237 that I really enjoyed, was kind of seeing these behind the scenes moments where you're actually seeing Kubrick interacting with some of the actors, or people just kind of milling around on the set. Do you feel any connection whatsoever to the indigenous people's story, or that aspect? Because I do feel like there is a level of resonance there for me, that there's something about the land and being in that land. And again, this battle, not only against native people, but against the earth, to kind of settle these parts of the earth that maybe are vortexes or power spots. Did you feel any connection to that?
Do you mean in Room 237, that
Yes.
interpretation?
Yes.
No, although, I mean, it's not that I don't in a general sense, but not while watching Room 237, although that one at least did correspond with a plot device in the film. And
Mm-hmm.
it did say it's built on an Indian burial ground, so, which wasn't in the novel. I'm wondering if there's a connection between, because it's like you started with one interest, which was the effect on the actors, and then you moved to the indigenous. Are those two subjects connected? I missed.
I feel they are, because I do feel like there's not necessarily a curse of the people who have, been on this land, and maybe had some negative influence by drawing attention there. I don't know. I just felt like there was perhaps some overlap with Stanley and his desire to be in this specific place, and maybe to add these elements of um, indigenous people, and kind of the bastardization of that whole subject matter from the white man's perspective. So I do feel like there is some commingling there. I guess maybe I'm not articulating it
I'm also
properly.
curious, because I like the devil in the details, to me, to really get to grips with something. Who do you think went mad? You said that people involved in Kubrick movies went mad afterwards. Who are you
Well,
thinking of?
clearly Shelley Duvall has had some mental health issues and has seemed to kind of go off of the rails. And obviously not right after making that film, but there could be some residual elements there. And I think Jack Nicholson, uh, for all intents and purposes, he has a problematic personal history. And again, you may not be able to make a direct link between working with Kubrick and his behavior because he probably had problematic behavior before he made that film. But I think people who have these very intense characters, I
Mhm.
think there is some residual effect from that.
Oh, absolutely, for sure. Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, I mean, they were on Eyes Wide Shut for 400 days, I think. It's the longest film shoot in history. And there is a theory about that, which I didn't develop in the Kubrickon, which had to do with, because it coincided, him casting those two coincided with Vivian Kubrick joining, if we're going to be neutral about it, the Church of Scientology.
Mm,
Um, and I can't say causally, which if there was a causal factor relation, which caused which, i.e., did Scientology get their hooks into his daughter because he was getting his mitts on Tom Cruise, or was it the other way around? I think it was more likely the first way. But either way, the idea that Kubrick there was some sort of struggle between Scientology and Kubrick, with his daughter as a hostage on the
mm,
one side and Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman as hostages on the other side. Now, that's obviously that would require a lot of filling in the blanks there. You could write a
mhm,
novel about it, but to me, it's very tantalizing, and it points to this larger idea of what Kubrick, particularly any filmmaker, but what was Kubrick doing besides making a movie when he took captive, in this framework, these actors, whoever they were, for a given film, and basically would not release them for months and months. Like Matthew Modine, he tried to stop Matthew Modine leaving the set of Full Metal Jacket after 9 months or something.
mm,
And they were still shooting, but I mean, it was just going to be one afternoon in a 1 year shoot or whatever, to be present at the birth of his son. Right, that was the level of Kubrick's control that he tried to maintain, and that suggests the kind of impact that he was consciously willing to have on his actors in the name of Project Stanley, whatever it was.
mhm,
Another example, kind of, and it's a different example, but of this a general same principle, that Nicole Kidman, for the sex scene in quotes, I mean just the flash cut of the
Yeah.
fantasy of her having sex with the naval officer, which
mhm,
is what L. Ron Hubbard was, the naval officers, as the Scientology link there. That there was 4 days filming and nobody was allowed in, and certainly Tom Cruise wasn't allowed in, while his wife was feigning having sex with a stranger. You can imagine the psychological effect that would have had on her husband. Maybe not Tom Cruise, because who knows, but if there was a genuine love bond there, it would be a negative effect, and that it was somewhat intentional on the part of Kubrick's part, because that's what directors do. They want to create the right psychological conditions for the performance, which in this case was feeling jealous and insecure and threatened.
mhm,
Right, so there's an overlap there between what a director does to maintain enough control to create the work that he wants to create, and the kind of control that's actually sadistic, borderline psychotic, that involves imprisoning people in your fantasy world and
mhm,
exercising complete dominion over their world, inner, outer certainly, but eventually even inner. To me, yeah, those are all very interesting or very necessary questions. Like, how sane or healthy is it to make a movie under those conditions? Obviously, it's a spectrum, because it's going to be to some degree some sort of artificial conditions. Otherwise, you wouldn't make a movie. but Kubrick took it to the extreme. And the other thing that's obvious to mention is the 80 takes or something. Like Jack Nicholson, I think, at certain points was on his knees, like begging Kubrick to tell him what he wanted because he couldn't do it another time.
I would love to see those
Jack,
outtakes.
this is Jack Nicholson, right? He's
Yeah.
not going to bend over for anyone except Stanley Kubrick, maybe.
It's good to speak with Jason again.
It was.
Yeah.
He's great.
He's looking good these days.
I always enjoy his conversations that we have with him. He's a very, very smart man, and it's nice to talk to smart people. I enjoy it.
He is. He's got a good, a masterful way of articulating complex ideas, which I struggle with very often. So yes, I appreciate his intellect and his way of grappling with many of the ideas that we've talked about on past podcasts and that he talks about in his books. Fantastic stuff. If none of you out there have checked out any Jasun Horsley material, you should look into it. He had a great podcast for several years called The Liminalist. I think you can still get it any place that you get podcasts, and he rounded it out at 300 episodes. So a lot of fantastic conversations embedded in all of that.
Two chickens. Well, maybe that's why they're so squawky, is they need more friends.
Are chickens pack animals?
Yeah, they're flock animals.
Yeah, I guess most birds are. Are there any loner birds?
Shrews, maybe.
Shrews?
The flightless bird, the little tiny bird from Australia. I think they're loners.
I thought a shrew was like a mole.
Oh, yeah.
That's why they don't fly.
Yeah, no. There's another one. There's a flightless bird that is a solo bird.
Oh, okay.
Not a shrew.
Maybe you're right and I'm wrong. Who knows?
That's possible. I don't know.
I don't know either. Anybody out there got any answers? If we were live streaming, we could ask you to hit the chat room up, but we are not live streaming. We haven't gotten the gumption to do that yet. But yes, it was a great conversation. I'm glad that somebody else who is maybe, I don't know if he would classify himself as a current film buff or a current film fanatic. Fanatic maybe is too dramatic of a word, but at least a former one doesn't get the Kubrick hype. Yeah. I like his movies, but I like a lot of movies. I wouldn't put necessarily his high above the ones that I genuinely think are works of art.
I may like Room 237 more than I like any Kubrick films. Just because I like the making fun of Barry Lyndon,
how boring it is,
which I thought was a beautiful film, but I'm not a big fan of Ryan O'Neal, and who I find to be ultra creepy. And so I like the fact that film made fun of Barry Lyndon.
I've never seen Barry Lyndon, so
it's
I don't know.
so boring. It's so just meandering, and it's like if someone tried to take a painting and make it into a film. So like every shot looks like a painting, which it sounds great, but it's just not interesting. It's not an interesting movie.
Okay. I'll make sure not to watch it.
I will make sure that you make sure not to watch it.
And
I will make sure not to watch it with you.
I got very much might be stretching it a bit, but I was a Clockwork Orange fan back in my late teens and 20s. I think there was something about, and Jason has sort of alluded to this previously and in Kubrickon, fascinated by the violence, fascinated by the irreverence. I never took that to nearly to that extent when I was a kid, but I think that I somehow was fascinated by the lawlessness of that group of people, the Droogs, in that movie, and the juxtaposition of that. And I think that's maybe where I first saw that in cinema, where you pair disturbing images with music that is, just a strange juxtaposition to what's taking place in front of your eyes. So they would have classical music to rape scenes and stuff like that. Um, so I was fascinated by that idea, and I think that I watched it several times during that time period, but I haven't watched it in probably, geez, at least 10 or 15 years. But I would like to see it again just to see where I land with it now. I know I'll probably have to do that by myself, but
I think that it goes back to what we were talking about creating, like certain filmmakers creating enough room for the viewer to embody or to feel that they embody those roles. And I think there's a fantasy element to some of his films where you may not want to be the Jack Nicholson character, for example, in The Shining. You may not want to be Alex in A Clockwork Orange, but there's this desire to explore what that psyche or what that pathology is. And so these films satisfy that.
Mhm.
So, when people were watching Sex in the City, for example, some women took on certain role of those roles and said, I'm a this, I'm a that. I fit into this. This is what my personality is like, is this specific character. So they would have viewing parties and actually try to embody that character and really be that person and imbue themselves in those roles. And I think if you are not someone who is a rapist, for example, or a murderer of your children, or, you know, have this dark part of your personality, but you want to observe that and then see where that fits or how you align yourself with that those types of films give you the opportunity to do that.
I could agree with that for sure. I'm trying to think of. I watched Full Metal Jacket in my early 20s, I would imagine, which made absolutely zero impression on me. I really don't remember anything from that movie except maybe somebody hung themselves. One of the soldiers did. That's about it. That's about all I remember from that. Eyes Wide Shut. I'm fascinated by that movie. It is a low quality movie for the most part, but there's something strange about it. Just in as far as cinema is concerned, and the kind of movie it is, and what it's intimating or maybe not intimating. There is a cold clinicalness to it, but sometimes I'm fascinated by works of art just because I'm curious as to what went into them. What drove somebody to make that? How did they make it? What was the end product that they were hoping to produce, or what kind of effect? And where does it what kind of effect does it actually have on
Yeah.
us? And just the social phenomenon of that too.
I think I'm more curious about films like that are low budget than
Sure.
films that have huge budgets.
Mhm.
When I see someone that has, $100 million to make a film and they make a shitty film, that doesn't really move me. I don't really give a shit what motivated them to make that film or what the messaging is behind that. But someone that has, $1,000 to make a film and they've made something really strange and interesting. I can think of a couple of different films like that where I just went
I was afraid.
I just looked back at that. No, they had a lot of money to make Bo's Afraid. But I look back on those films and go, "Wow, this is this is a really creative film," and they had no money. Imagine what if this person did have money to make a
Mhm.
film, what kind of film they would make. Um, I think of, I can think of a dozen movies like that where having a lack of funding actually made a better film than having a lot of money, because this person didn't second guess themselves. There was a deeper creative motivation, because they had to be more industrious with the money that they did have.
For sure. Definitely. I got mixed up. I thought you were talking about people who had a lot of money and then they made something strange, like Beau is Afraid would be a perfect example of a what the fuck moment. And that movie that we watched that I think you checked out from the library, about this guy who, I want to say Wheels is in the title or something like that, where this guy plays lots of different roles. Like his occupation is to serve strange roles in very strange situations, and he goes from one situation to another throughout the length of this movie. And I can't for the life of
I'm
me.
drawing a blank.
You don't even. It's not that you don't remember the title; you don't remember the movie.
I have no idea
Okay.
what you're talking about.
Gotcha.
Film or title.
There's an erect penis in one of the scenes, in one of the roles that he plays, where he is naked and he is. Yeah, it's so otherworldly and strange. It's hard to describe. So I'm sorry, I shouldn't even have brought it up if I couldn't have implanted something concrete in your mind.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. Where to go from there? Huh?
I don't know.
Anyway, it was great to talk to Jason. I'm interested with the direction that he's taken, and he has done that several times in his life, where there are different chapters where he goes from one living situation to another living situation, and I'm assuming for very specific reasons, just because of who Jason is. And I find that level of adventure and openness and willingness refreshing. Most people don't operate like that in the world, but he takes chances and gets into different situations. And this current one seems very, very interesting, in Spain, with a little chunk of land, trying to. And I meant to ask him more about how self-sufficient they actually were. Like, does he still have to go to the market every day or every several times a week, or do they pretty much produce their own?
He said he did. He
Yeah.
went to the market. He
Okay.
didn't say we didn't get a schedule, but he did mention that.
Okay. I was trying to think of a funny joke, but it wasn't coming. I'm hungry right now, so I'm a little distracted, and I've got to get on Chicken Run building here very soon. So.
Oh, that's right.
Yes.
Cool. The chickens will be happy.
They will be happy.
Yep.
God, it needs to get done. That's why I
Yes.
feel like when I have free time, I've got to utilize it.
Yep.
So we're going to try to keep this under 20 minutes this time.
Yep.
Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully it compels you to go out and check out some of Jason's work. Again, his podcast is fantastic. I could recommend the last 5 of his books. That's all I've read by him. But they're all really, really good. So yeah, check them out. Links are in the episode notes.
I'm just looking.
I know, it looked like you were smiling at somebody that was smiling back at you.
I'm just looking at the books. They make
Looking
me
at the
happy.
books.
I like books.
You still haven't integrated both of our books, though. All of my books and all of your books. I get the feeling you don't want to do that. It's like a joint bank account, a joint book account. Like my books are going to affect your books or something.
No.
Affect your books. Okay. With an STB.
Oh, God.
B, not D. B for book.
I know. I got it. No, I don't know how to do it. It's such a huge project.
I have a lot fewer books than you do, my dear.
I know.
You'd just be throwing a few of my books on your piles, your many piles. Yeah, it's not going to hurt. You just tell me what the class or categories are, and I'll put them. The
category is we need more shelves.
No shit. Yes. And discernment. Can anybody offer any simple discernment advice?
How dare you?
There's a place where discernment and space meet up. It's a very tangible place.
I don't know where that is.
And we're there. We live in it. This room is where that You're just looking at how you look.
No, I'm looking at the doggies to see if that makes horns on my head. But it doesn't, which is good.
Okay. We hope
All
you
right.
enjoyed it. Much love to you. If you want to contact us for guest recommendations, casserole recipes, whatever, just to say hello, the Melt Podcast at protonmail.com or
Hunter-Muse at protonmail.com.
and you can get pretty much to anything and all things Melt related by going to themeltpodcast.net.
I almost poked myself in the eye.
You're watching the unraveling of Hunter.
Yes,
No,
exactly.
not unraveling.
Slightly.
Okay.
Unfurling.
Thank you for listening, and until next time. Fare thee well. Do you like our new Jim Bob pinned logo up there? I like it a lot.
I
Thanks,
do
Jim
too.
Bob.
Thanks, Jim Bob.
Goodbye.
Meow.